Welcome to IMPACT's webinar series. IMPACT is a clinical trial training platform funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to increase capacity for clinical trials with children and pregnant people in Canada. This webinar was developed for anyone who wants to learn more about clinical trials. You can share it and register online to attend future webinars live. Our free webinars will continue to cover cutting-edge topics in pediatric and perinatal clinical trials. To learn more about future webinars, visit our website www.impacttrials.ca. After the webinar, we invite you to check out other IMPACT Knowledge Hub resources on dual code. These include courses on a wide variety of introductory and intermediary topics in clinical trials. All IMPACT courses are created and peer-reviewed by experts from across Canada and provide certificates of completion. We hope you enjoy this free and educational content brought to you by IMPACT. To learn more about working with us, you can find our contact information online.
Welcome to today's webinar on lessons learned from the Innovative Pediatric Clinical Trials, also known as iPCT network. My name is Nancy Butcher, and I'm the co-director of IMPACT. Today, we are really excited to have Tanis Erickson, who recently retired from the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba, also known as CRIM. She most recently held the positions of Executive Director of the Research Support Unit and the Innovative Pediatric Clinical Trials Network. We are also delighted to have Nuveen Kunai, a professor in the departments of pediatrics and epidemiology and biostatistics at Western University. So today I'd like to start today's session with a land acknowledgement. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous people of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. So today we have a lot planned for this session. So just to briefly go over how we will structure the session today. First, Tanis and Nuveen will present for about 30 minutes, and then IMPACT Director Lauren Kelly will host a 20-minute interview-style Q&A session with our speakers. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the session today for general questions. You can put them in the chat or hold them to the end and put your hand up. And following that, we will have a 30-minute closed discussion period between the speakers and the IMPACT Fellows and the Trials Enrichment Group learners. So if you're a member of these groups, please just stay on this Zoom link for that discussion period. And also, I'd like to invite any learners who happen to be on the call today from any of our other partner networks, like Rare Kids Can or CanSat, for example, or former IMPACT Fellows. If you wanted just to join us for this discussion period, please just send Chelsea or I a message so that we can give you access. So for today's webinar, the learning objectives are to gain an appreciation for multi-site trial management, to understand the advantages of working with a trial network, to learn the skills necessary for protocol development and trial implementation, and to have an appreciation of the impact of clinical trials on patient care and public health. Welcome, Tanis.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation to present to the group today. I'm very excited about the opportunities that the fellows have to be part of IMPACT, and consider our discussions today to be an important part of the knowledge translation process that we're still engaged in from the iPCT network. So just to highlight a little bit about iPCT, we were and mostly Canadian, but also an international network of trialists and partners. And our main goals of the iPCT were to conduct 4 innovative pediatric clinical trials in emergency rooms across Canada, as well as some in New Zealand and Australia. Now, there was many pieces that were innovative in this network development. First of all, was doing it as a network, as a group of pooled resources, but also looking at innovations in each one of the trials. They had their unique innovations, and it was things like including discrete choice experiments, having a trial embedded within a trial, like in the no-out study, the use of Bayesian statistics to help with sample size calculations and our patient population, our key groups, and also novel treatment methods. So there was lots of little innovative pieces that went into this. But I think one of the key pieces was trying to work as a group and having the most amount of pooled resources that we could. So there's a lot of strategies that went into developing this network initially. I didn't come on with the group at the beginning in the development of the network. I kind of came on after it was funded. So unfortunately, I wasn't part of those really good discussions at the beginning, but I know that there was many strategies that were used to develop this network. And I think it's the multi-trial management is more complex than single trial management, but I think the benefits are really exponentially outweigh the cost and the extra time it takes. It's key to take advantage of relationships that you have and develop additional relationships. One of the key things around multi-trial management is really having a focus on those project management strategies, looking at performance deliverables and timelines. Those are critical in keeping all of the studies moving forward. There's lots of things around managing regulatory approvals and contracts and things. That is one of the key benefits of having those pooled resources in a central location. So I'm not going to read you all the slides and everything because you'll have access to those afterwards. But to try and take advantage of the resources and the capabilities of everyone in your network, find out where the key resources people are, and to do as much as possible in the central site. So in the iPCT, we did drafts of regulatory approvals for Health Canada for the CTAs, the clinical trial applications, also with local boards, ethics boards. We tried to do as much as possible. Contracts, we developed sort of standard templates that can then be used to adapt at local level. So we did all of those things at the central site to make it easier for each of the participating sites. A lot of benefits come in the cost savings, because if you're doing things centrally, then not each of the individual sites has to go through the same process. Having a lead PI and a lead research coordinator or a network executive really helps to streamline all of the things that happens, and to keep things and support individual teams that may be having challenges about a particular issue. So having that team, co-leadership and having that shared leadership accountability across all of the sites is really helpful. We had sort of multi-level teams because we had 4 studies. Each of the studies had a team, but we also had a larger, broader network team. So there was lots of levels, but that also allowed for lots of opportunities for co-leadership and actually sharing the load of work that was required. The benefit for the individual sites and the local PIs is that they can receive support from the lead site, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel for every task that they have at their site, that it can make them actually easier for them to participate in clinical trials. Of course, you can't have all the benefits without having some of the challenges. So we know that each site, each academic institution has varied requirements and systems and processes. Trying to develop key points of contact with each of those institutions is really critical, so that you have somebody to go to ask quick questions and navigate through the system. Having really good relationships with your funding partners, local funding or national funding, so that you can always work with them on any challenges that you're having. We had federal funding and local funding, so there was always a challenge where at the beginning we weren't spending our money fast enough according to our timelines, because the studies were just getting going, and we had to explain to our federal funders why the money wasn't going out and show our projections for the future. And then towards the end, we kind of, in some sites, we were a little tight on money, but we were able to go back to the funders and get additional things. So I think that there's a lot, all the challenges that we faced also offered us a lot of opportunities. Another challenge is sort of managing conflict. So the bigger the team gets, the more opportunity you have for some conflicts between ideologies or goals. And so having good and open dialogue on, what everyone's goals and objectives are at each site, as well as the national site, helps to ease the transition and have everyone work successfully through any kind of challenges. We learned a lot of lessons through iPCT. A lot of lessons along the way, and then when we had a retrospective look at the end of it, we learned, had a lot of good thoughts. Things always take longer than you think, including study setup and recruitment. One of the benefits of having multi-site trials is you have a broader patient population that you can use for recruitment, but still things take time. We worked through a pandemic. We didn't see that on our crystal ball. That added just about 3 years to our overall timeline for our study. So we had a lot of lessons learned around dealing with unforeseen circumstances. So hopefully we'll never have a pandemic again, but it gave us the opportunity to learn on the fly on how to deal with just really, unanticipated consequences of circumstances. So learning to do that. The benefits of working as a network far outweigh the negatives, even though it may be a little bit more time up front in getting things organized. You need to plan for adequate pharmacy support, especially for drug procurement. If you're doing a placebo-controlled trial where you need to have someone develop and test the stability of placebos. So you can't discount adequate pharmacy support, both at a national, like a network level and local level. And having close oversight of the contracts and ethics processes to avoid any delays. Funding partners are key, like I mentioned before, always communicating with them. Lots of them have reporting requirements, but keeping really good relationships with your funding partners is critical, because invariably you may come to a time when you will require additional funding for certain items that are in your study budget. And you can always, if you have a good relationship with them, you can always go back to them and see what your opportunities might be. Their budgeting is critical, especially at first, and budgeting, I think, is one of the hardest things to do when you're planning a study. You've got the protocol development, which is a challenging task to accomplish, but then trying to see in a budget everything that might possibly impact the study. So there's lots of budget templates that are available. Lots of websites have those, so that it gives you a really good list of some of the expenses that you might encounter. What we found across the national network is that hourly rates for research staff vary widely from province to province. So sitting in your home site saying that everybody makes X number of dollars an hour at that level, you have to know what each site is, what their expenses are going to be incurred at what level, so that you can properly factor that into the budget. And also allow enough time for responses and replies for regulatory approvals and contracts and amendments, and the staff time that it takes to navigate that system, because invariably those types of tasks take longer than you originally anticipate. So making sure that you're realistic, like the budget has to be realistic. So from a network perspective, those are the key things that I really wanted to highlight. Sharing successes, so we did have some sites that were really high achieving as far as recruitment and struggled less with contracts and things like that, and having the ability for those people to share their tips and tricks with other people in the network, we found was very invaluable. So that kind of goes across the cross-pollination between the sites at the network level, and having those teams available for everyone to touch on. That's about it that I can get. I know there'll be more questions coming up, but from a high level perspective, that's it from the network perspective. And I wanted to make sure that Naveen has sufficient time to talk about his specific study and protocol. So I think it's over to you, Naveen, now, and I think you have the capacity to control your slides. I'll advance to the next one. Oh, there we go.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I also echo Tannis's comments on the network. I really appreciate being invited here today to talk. It's great reflecting on our experiences. It's learning experience for everyone. So I mean, we're on this we're talking as we move into how to do things on the ground. It's really important that that we focus on how different sites will conduct your study, what sort of oversight they will have, how they're going to enroll. So it's best to keep the relationships that you already have and build on those existing relationships. Because if you already have relationships with interested parties at sites, you have those relationships for a reason. Maybe you work well together. Maybe you have similar interests. Maybe your sites are very similar in the way they conduct research. So the first people that you should go to say, hey, do you want to be part of my study, are the people that you've previously collaborated with. It's a really good idea to present your research idea at a network meeting. So when I say a network meeting, I don't necessarily mean a scientific meeting where you present posters, but at a network meeting like Peds Emerge Research Canada, which stands for PERC, which is our emergency research network for pediatric research that's done in the acute care setting in Canada. And the advantage of that is that there is a submission process, there's an approvals process, but you get a peer review. So there's a peer review that is done behind the scenes with 2 to 3 PERC members of your proposal, your protocol. But there's also a chalk talk, if you will, where you present to the PERC group and you can get feedback in real time on your proposal and being able, not just on your methods, but being able to launch it at given sites. And the other aspect is that you should, it's a bit of a give and take. Every relationship is transactional. So you want to say, yes, we would like you to be part of our site, but this is what we'll give you in return. We will train your staff, and your staff may go on to be highly qualified personnel in certain areas. You will receive monetary support to pay for research personnel in your sites, and you can leverage that support to run your own studies. We may give you capital in the form of things like, iPads to record data that you can keep, things like that. So it's good to stress those transactional relationships. In terms of the implementation of best practices, this is something that Good Clinical Practices Division 5 has some oversight over. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you engage your team, your study team, on a regular basis. Now that you've got your interested site investigators, you've got their research coordinators at the helm, you want to have regular meetings with these people. And typically these are done in a monthly fashion. Finding a day and a time is the hardest part, but once you have these regular meetings and they're in everyone's calendar, you would expect that most people will attend. And then you want the site PIs with their research coordinators to do things according to Good Clinical Practices Division 5. So if your study is Health Canada regulated, this is an absolute must. And you have to make sure that all sites are functioning within the guidance outlined by our federal regulatory bodies, which is Health Canada in Canada and the NIH in the US. So you want to have an initial site visit to make sure that they're e-reg binders, what we call the regulatory binders. They used to be paper binders, now they're electronic, and we call them e-regs. You want to make sure that those are tidied up, all the T's are dotted, all the I's are crossed, and really that's done in person. Now, when we were doing the spore trials, we did a lot of that virtually, and there's no replacement for actually being there in person when a site is launching. And you want all of that documented in terms of training. So your research coordinators at each site, your site coordinators, they're not going to be enrolling for you on the ground. It will be their staff that will be enrolling. So they're volunteers, or they're experiential learners, or they're research nurses. You want to make sure that those people get the same training that you give your team. And you can do the training in multiple ways. You can have an in-person component, which we typically do, followed by a didactic component, and an experiential component, where they're actually doing things on the fly and someone's observing them. And sometimes what we do is we will have a simulation of an enrollment, and we will do that at the lead site, and then send it to all the other sites to maybe do the same. So the next thing I want to talk about is the criteria for selecting sites. And this is one of the learnings that I took from the SPORE initiative, is that when we launched SPORE, we did it based on who had a trial that was deemed worthy of a CIHR application. And there were 4 trials at the time that were deemed worthy. And then the understanding was that each trial's site, so there were 4 sites, 4 trials, that each of those sites would be running each other's studies. And we threw in maybe 1 or 2 extra sites for good measure. I think what we could do in the future, for the most part, this worked very well. But I think from my perspective, what I would have done in the future is I would have done a site feasibility assessment. Now, site feasibility assessments are expected by Health Canada. And if you were to ever to get an inspection, they will ask you for the site feasibility assessments. So we created, for one of my trials that's outside of SPORE right now, that's a multi-center PERC study, is that we did a site feasibility assessment, because we want to know how many patients with the index condition do you see a month? Do you have personnel to enroll? Is there buy-in from your clinical staff for this intervention that we're going to do? Or do you already do it, and therefore you don't need a clinical trial? Is there infrastructure to support this in terms of regulatory approvals at your site? Tanis mentioned pharmacy. Pharmacy is really, really important, because they're the ones that's going to make your investigational product. They're going to create it. They're going to label it. They're going to make a kit out of it. So you want to make sure that that each site has a pharmacy that's capable of doing this. You also want to make sure that there's no overlap with other studies being done at a given site. A site may say, oh no, I can't study fractures because there's already a fracture study going on here. So that's not a site that you want. Or you want to be able to recruit with spreading out of when you're going to actually enroll. And you want a site that has a history of timely regulatory and contract approvals, because some sites take a very long time to do this, and other sites can do this very quickly. And you also want to make sure that if you're running a Health Canada study, you want to make sure that the research coordinators and the teams at the sites have experience running Health Canada studies, because the oversight for a Health Canada regulated study is very different from a non-Health Canada regulated study. There's also some issues related to patients and family involvement. So what you want to make sure that what's a good idea is to make sure that before you do anything, before you create anything involving patient-facing components, such as posters to advertise the study, screening and eligibility, pitches, informed consent documents, and even follow-up questionnaires and some of the outcomes measures you're going to use, you want to make sure that you have a team in place that can review those from a patient perspective. So at my center, we have a family advisory council that will look at all of this, and will tell you what would work and what wouldn't work. Pilot studies are also very good at doing this, at informing this. And having a patient partner, or what I would say is a person with lived experience on your team, is essential to make sure that you're sending out information to patients that they can understand, that will not put them off, and that is using inclusive language. I think I skipped over a slide here. So once you've done your study, once you've got your team, once you've got your patient partners, and once you're sort of got your study rolling, what you want to do is, before you launch a study, you always want to think about knowledge translation, or what we call knowledge mobilization in today's parlance. That should really be part of your study at the very beginning, because you want to have these players in place. So you want to engage local partners to disseminate your work locally at your individual institution. So that would be maybe your Children's Health Foundation, or it could be your nurse educators, which are big proponents of your work. Or it could also be the media at your local institution. And then you also want to think about national knowledge mobilization groups. So Children's Healthcare Canada is one, TREC, translating emergency research for kids, is another one. SKIP, if you do pain research, which is solutions for kids in pain, is another one. And then there's also multiple podcasts who can support your work. So you want to build those in and make those relationships very early, so that when your study is done, you can hit the ground running and you don't have to start from scratch. Quality improvement projects at the end of your study are also a good idea. So involving these people early on, so again, you can hit the ground running. There is an very important aspect to consider in terms of diversity and representation of different populations in trials. So we have to realize that our patient population in Canada is now quite diverse. And one of the things that we always put in our REB applications, our Research Ethics Board applications, is that we're going to exclude patients in whom English is not their first language. And I urge you to try to get around that as best you can. And some of the ways I do this is that, and I think a lot of people on this webinar will probably attest to this, is that there's different language you can use. So you can say, yes, the patient has to fully comprehend English or French, or if you're doing work in an Indigenous community, in that language. But if they can't do that, can we have a native language interpreter who can do that for them? And we put that in the exclusion criteria: absence of a native language interpreter so it cannot speak one of the primary languages in the absence of a native language interpreter. That way, people whose first language is, say, Arabic, if they have a native language interpreter there, they can still participate in the study. The challenge that you will face is that the outcome measures may not be translated in their language. So you can always think about having translation services there to translate your work into different languages. And of course, you don't need to do it for all the languages, but you need to probably think about it for some of the more common languages that you see in your center. There's also translation services now available that are done virtually. So Voice is one of those, and then different centers may have different ones. That's the one we use at our center. And then the last point I wanted to make was involvement of Indigenous communities. So the Tri-Council Policy Statement number 2 has good guidance on that. It is quite lengthy, so you can always have it summarized by one of the AI large language models. But as soon as you submit, if you're going to involve an Indigenous community, as soon as you submit that to your ethics board, they're going to go through TCPS2 to look to make sure that you've done all of the things that's required for engagement of Indigenous communities. So you want to think about that ahead of time. Okay, and I think we are up. We are at the end and gonna up for questions right now.
Thank you, Tanis. Thank you, Naveen, for that insightful presentation filled with so much rich information and practical tips for the group here. Now, I just want to go ahead and invite Dr. Lauren Kelly, who most, if not of you, probably all know as the Impact Co-Director, to join us for a discussion. So Lauren was actually in the unique position of being a fellow during the days of iPCT, which meant that she got to learn from these trialists firsthand in real time. So Lauren has a few questions for both of you that others might also benefit from.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Tanis and Naveen, so much for sharing some of your learnings with us today. And I was very specific not to focus on the individual trials because I think, we could have talked about 4 trials for a whole hour. But what was really unique was that these 4 trials had 4 different sponsors and 4 different leaders at 4 different institutions, but then central funding and central coordination. And so I guess my first question is for you, Naveen. You have done trials in this network framework, but also, independently and not in the network framework. So I'm keen to hear from you, what were the benefits and maybe some of the things that might have been made a little bit harder from being in a network, and just keen to hear your thoughts about that experience.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. That's a great question. So, the big picture, the big message that I want to get across is doing a study within a network, hands down, has way more advantages than doing it outside of a network. And anytime something is multi-centered at my center and involving some of my constituency, I always say, do you have a research network? Go to your research network. And the reason why is because you can get peer review. You'll get peer review behind the scenes for your work, with expert reviewers that you may or may not have ever met. And you can get there's opportunities for a live in-person chalk talk, as I mentioned, where they will have a look at your protocol on the screen and tell you what's going to work and what isn't going to work. And usually at networks, you have representatives from each site, and you're going to have people that are going to stand up and put their hand up and say, hey, that's not going to fly in Western Canada, or that's not going to fly in Eastern Canada, and this is why. And then you can modify your protocol before you even, launch it. And this is really, really important feedback. The other thing the network does is it helps you with funding applications. So, if your trial is multi-centered, you're probably going to want tri-council funding, and they will help you to polish up your application. You'll be able to be put in contact with people who have experience doing this. And most importantly, they'll give you an endorsement letter, because you'll be able to access various sites within the network, and you'll be able to have an endorsement letter. Some of the downsides are that, yes, it's going to take longer. There's a little bit more regulatory hurdles, but the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages.
Yeah, that's great. And Tanis, my next question is for you, because I think not only did you have these 4 lead sites and there were, I think, 2 other recruitment sites, but you mentioned that some of the sites performed at different rates. So some of them had really smooth contracts, really quick recruitment, and some of them couldn't open a couple of those trials. And so I'm just keen to hear from you, your perspective on what did the sites have that did really well? And what did the institutions, what did you notice? Because obviously you're working with 4 different institutional sponsors. In terms of what supports were available for these trialists, what was different and what did you think was maybe the most beneficial to support these trialists? Sorry, that's a very long question and probably too much.
I'm trying to remember all the points. So I think one of the key things is that the sites that were very successful, and especially the kickoff went smoothly, is that they had well-developed research capabilities within their institutions and a really good relationship between the clinical side and the academic side, so that those 2 pieces talk to each other. There was a group of people in sort of a research support network, which a lot of our sites have, like WICRI has, Saskatchewan is starting, CHEO has, all of those groups have that kind of core network where you can go to get the actual clinical research supports that you need. They had experienced clinicians who were used to doing research, supporting their co-lead researchers. So in our case, so Darcy Beer led one of the studies. Now, Darcy wasn't on site, on staff, on shift every time, but his peers within the institution knew about Darcy's study and they were willing to support Darcy's study. So having that kind of on the ground collaboration amongst your peers is critical, and in the nursing staff as well. Then I think having that well-established network helped with the contracts and the ethics approvals. That really, so a really good relationship with your academic institution where the contracts go through and things like that, and knowing who to go to when there was little challenges and little hiccups that you could get through them quickly.
That's really great. And I think, I mean, it speaks to the challenge of navigating all of the complexities across the institutions. I don't know, Naveen, if there's anything you wanted to add to that point around the differences in the supports between the trialists.
Yeah, so some institutions may have a very keen clinical division that will support your work, but they may not have necessarily the regulatory support within their institution to help you steer your work. So they may not have a mature contracts office. They may not have a mature peer review area. They may not have a pharmacy that can support your work. So one of the advantages of doing, again, multi-center work within iPCT is that you can partner with a center that can do all of these things for you. So I think most people on the call here have heard of a CRO, a clinical research organization. And CROs do all these things like monitoring, they help you with your ethics applications, they liaise with Health Canada, and multiple other things that they do. They will invoice you at the end, but what you have to remember is that they will do all of the things in the background to help your trial function really well. And because Winnipeg was involved, their data coordinating center served that role. And WICRI in Edmonton, the Women and Children's Research Institute, their centers serve the monitoring role. So even though your center may not have the capability to do certain things, other centers will. And creation of the database project was also something that we had essentially contracted out to another center because they were part of the multi-center grant.
And I will say this is a model that I've now taken for my own trials that run with a central data coordinating center that different trials use. And so I think there's lots to be said around some of the sites. Not all of them need to build expertise in every single area, but working in a network allows that expertise to kind of be shared more seamlessly across some of the sites because not all of the sites have the same amount of resources or supports available. So I think that's a really great point. My next question for you, Naveen, I know we said we weren't going to talk specifically too much detail about each of the trials, but I know from being involved, my involvement was really at the beginning and less so throughout, was your trial changed a lot. So I think it's like there were so many lessons learned for me around trial design. I think just from even your individual trial. And I think as a trialist now, getting comfortable with the idea of changing your protocol and like abandoning an intervention arm or making a big change. And I'm just keen to have you sort of walk through how your trial changed from the first design to the trial that, Ketodex today, and just kind of how you made those decisions of, look, we have to stop, we have to change, it's time. I think that's a really hard thing for some of us. So I'm just kind of keen for you to reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, some of all the changes that were made in the Ketodex trial, which is my trial, gives me a little bit of PTSD, but I'm happy to share. So basically, as Tanis mentioned, this trial was done through a pandemic. So there was a lot of drug shortages. So, anybody buying a Toyota Sienna would have been on a wait list, and anybody running the Ketodex trial, which is me, would have been on a wait list. So what happened is that we initially planned for this trial it was initially called INK, intranasal ketamine. So we were going to trial intranasal ketamine versus IV ketamine for orthopedic manipulation in kids, but there was a shortage of ketamine. Not only was there a shortage of ketamine, but there was a shortage of 100 milligram per ml, so the concentration we wanted to use ketamine. So then we realized that we could not do our study unless we changed the investigational product, which is a huge modification. So what we did was we did a systematic review, and we did it very quickly, and we tried to find if there was equipoise for any other agent. And we were fortunate that we found equipoise for intranasal dexmedetomidine. So we modified our investigational product, our arm, and we renamed this trial Ketodex. And then what happened was that some sites weren't able, their pharmacies may not have been able to procure the drug, or their clinical team felt that it wouldn't necessarily be amenable in the study, in the particular patient population that they see. So we had to modify the number of sites, and we had to bring in other sites. So happy to say that the Ketodex trial is actually 5 patients from being done. It's the first phase, which is the dose finding phase, and it's enrolling quite well. But one of the lessons that I learned, and I learned this from a very experienced clinical trialist, Stephen Friedman at Calgary, was he said, because when you go to do your trial, you have your protocol. It's been approved by the Research Ethics Board. It's gone to Health Canada, been approved by them. It's been approved by the network. But then you go to the individual sites and say, hey, are you guys going to do this with me or not? And what happens is the site says, yeah, we like your trial. We would love to do this with you, but you can't use that device in our patients because we don't have it. Or we can only enroll for these amount of hours a day because we don't have coverage for this. And our physicians would not want you to change this outcome measure. So then what happens is that you keep having to change your protocol at every single site you go to. So what Stephen told me was that he said, just launch your trial. Don't wait to make all of these changes and wait for institutional and federal approval. Launch your trial based on the approved protocol and make the changes as you go. And that way, you're not losing time, because remember, as soon as you're funded, you're on a clock to get your work done. And this way, you don't lose time when you're enrolling, and all of those protocol changes can be wrapped into your protocol publication, and you can justify them that way.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned a really great point, and a lesson that I've learned in my third trial. I did one, but I didn't for my first two, was about site feasibility assessments, about formally assessing how many patients do you have, but also what is standard of care at your site? Do you use this device? Like trying to assess some of that early on in your site selection. I think we've already decided we're going to make an impact template. So I may to tack you on the shoulder for your copy. But I think that's a really great point around just like not waiting forever, because everyone has changes they want to see in these trials, and some of them are not necessarily well, most of them are not actually going to change the outcomes you're looking at. So I just have one last question, and then we're going to open it up, and it's for you, Tanis, because I think, IPCT ran for a long time, and obviously it was a really huge endeavor. So what do we do, when we run out of money, and acknowledging that, not everyone is in a stage where we're in these great, big networks like Pediatric Emergency Research Canada, or connected maybe as well as we could be with some of our institutions or funders. So my last question is really like, how can like junior trialists or folks who are maybe just starting to get connected, how can we set the stage or build like good relationships with funders so that there is a possibility of potentially asking for money if we run out?
Okay. So first of all, going back to a couple of the points I made, budget very carefully. Monitor your spending as you go along. So as you're hitting those milestones, have an idea of how much you should have spent, so that if you're going to have the potential of running out of money, you know it sooner rather than later, not when the bank account is dry already. Because having good relationships with your funders, I think when you go to local funding agencies, and you present your study to them or you make an application, continue that relationship. Don't just stop that relationship once you get the approval letter. Continue that relationship. Let them know how important the study is, how you're doing, how progress is being made, because then if you get to the chance where you're 3 months or for 3 years into a 4-year study and you're going to run out of money, you can start that dialogue then. Also, you could have an opportunity to look for additional funding, somebody who didn't come on board initially, but who might be able to come on board later. So there's all kinds of local foundations and institutions that have some capability to fund studies. Maybe not full studies like when you made your initial application, but they might be able to give you small pockets of funding. So I think watching your funding as it goes along so that you have as much notice as possible that you are going to run out of funding. Fingers crossed that you don't. I was in clinical research for a long time. There was very few studies that had leftover money at the end. So, but I think keeping on top of it and knowing as much in advance as possible that you're going to be in financial, facing some financial challenges.
Thanks, Janice. That's helpful. Okay, Nancy, I think those were all of my questions, and thank you both. I think I'll throw it back over to you, Nancy, to take some questions from the audience.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting and informative. So just looking to the audience now to see if anybody has some additional questions. And I see Gita has her hand up. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much to both of you for the presentation. I had to hop on a little bit late, but my goodness, as an early career researcher, these learnings are so impactful. So thank you. I had a very specific question about the voice translation services. And we've run into this a few times. We're running into it clinically as well, getting access to translator services clinically. But as far as research projects, do you guys or other participants on the line have suggestions on how to be able to include this in proposals? Do most places include this in a budget to have that? It's not part of what we have offered as part of like the research offerings currently, but we're all identifying for equity deserving groups. I'm from Saskatchewan, and so we have lots of newcomers to Canada and lots of individuals that would benefit from translation services. Just wondering about more specific maybe problem solving around that.
I can probably handle that question. Good to meet you, Dr. Reeb. So Voice was purchased by our institution. So I was very fortunate. I didn't have to buy it myself. I think if you budgeted for it, if your institution doesn't have it, it's a good idea. There's been a number of apps, including Say Hi, that work very well, but they've been discontinued. And you really need the hospital to be okay. You need the research institute, who's the hospital regulatory body, to be okay with the translation service that you're using. So that's the number one hurdle. Number two, yes, you can put this into REB applications. I'm going to put on my REB chair hat. I chair the REB at Western. And one of the things that the REB will come back to you with is they'll say someone translated this ICF, who translated it, and where's their signature. So there has to be an attributability, a signature that's attributable to a person that translated it. Our REB is working through how we're going to navigate this because Health Canada wants something on paper. So it might involve an eFax. It might involve a signature that is dropped into a REDCap form. We're not quite sure how we're going to do this yet, but that will pose a bit of a problem. It's best to have the translator there in person, to be honest.
All right, maybe I'll go ahead with a question while the audience is thinking. So one thing I'm wondering about, and it's a little bit of a tricky question, I think, but when you're navigating, these different relationships, across the country, lots of different backgrounds, lots of different personalities, and lots of different passion, when it comes to clinical trials, in kids, conflict can arise. And do you have any advice or tips for researchers that are just starting out? Like, how do you navigate those relationships or tackle conflict management?
I can take the first stab at that, and then Naveen can add. I think it falls down to basic conflict management skills. Like the first thing that has to happen is people have to understand everyone's perspectives. So trying to have people explain their situation and their take on the situation, and then try to find mutually agreeable ground in the middle. And I think just open and honest communications. So you do need kind of somebody like we always had when we experienced things like that, we had someone from the central network kind of meeting with the two parties that were in conflict and kind of facilitating the discussion. So saying, what's your issue, and what can we find? Sometimes it took some real creative problem solving from the network's perspective. And we, in all cases, most cases, we were able to make everybody happy. There was a couple cases where one party was still dissatisfied at the end. But when we looked at it we had a steering committee from the network, and when we looked at it from the broader network or with our lead PI for the whole SPORE project, a decision sometimes had to be made one way or the other, and it was usually with the overall SPORE grant in mind.
Thanks, Tanis. I think that's really helpful. It's just something to be aware of. It's just, it's so rare that difficult conversations are going to come up, over the course of trials. And especially when you get mitigating unexpected circumstances like, pandemics, for example, right? Like, prepare for the unexpected.
Yeah.
All right, Terry.
Yes, no, I just wanted to say, congratulations to the team for setting this pediatric clinical trial network using the SPORE initiative. I mean, you started in 2016 or 17, the ground writing, and then, things got started. So it has been, and it's not finished, right? You are still recruiting a few patients for some of those trials. Publications in the New England came out just some weeks ago from one of those trials. So it's fascinating to see how much can be accomplished, when we get all together. And what I just wanted to say is that my CERN, moving forward, becoming an academic research organization, learn a lot from this experience. My sons moved, toward being an academic research organization in 2018. So we were part of all those conversations, sharing, responsibilities. We took the data management, responsibilities, and the monitoring piece. So I wanted that this lesson is really learned, at my CERNs, and now that the service that we are offering as an academic organizations were built, partially using your experience and those projects as well. So you are right, Naveen, there is institutions where there is no expertise or little expertise in some of those requirements when you conduct a regulated trial. And this is, how my sons learn, how do we develop, those capacities, and we can help investigators. So congratulations again, because this is absolutely unique, I think, in the history of pediatric clinical trial in Canada, having such a wonderful network producing high quality research and translating in high impact publications.
Thanks, Terry. There's a question in the chat from one of our impact fellows, Lytton. So she's saying, thanks so much for a wonderful presentation and for sharing your thoughts. My question is, how can Bayesian methodologies improve the efficiency, ethical considerations, and statistical power of single arm and multi-arm trials in pediatric clinical research? despite the complexities involved? And are there any pitfalls from your past experience that we should be aware of? And I will mention that next week, Rare Kids Can is hosting a workshop on Bayesian approaches in clinical trials that's being led by one of our impact mentors, Anna Heath. So we'll put that in the chat for interested folks as well to learn more.
I can probably tackle that one. Anna's on the call, so I'm sure she may jump in to correct me. So my current trial, KetoDex, also featured this Bayesian methodology, but the current trial is the ALICE trial, which is comparing 3 different investigational products or interventions for anxiolysis in kids undergoing laceration repair. So I'm just going to look at the chat. So, I can't speak positively enough about this methodology. The details of it are over my head, but every time I talk to my statistical team led by Anna, I learn more and more and more. And so the main thing is that it improves trial efficiency. So for the trial that I'm doing, we're comparing 3 different things. So normally, if you did this in a non-Bayesian adaptive approach or a frequentist approach, trial would probably involve a lot more patients, take way more time. But this approach, it actually lowers your sample size so that your trial becomes more efficient in terms of enrollment, but it also becomes more cost effective. So it's cheaper. In terms of ethics, Bayesian approaches can also be helpful. So in this trial, there's going to be an interim analysis and they may drop an arm. So that reduces the risk of a child being randomized to a less effective treatment, which plays into the ethics component. In terms of the pitfalls, the complexities may not be fully understood by grant reviewers. So having these trials funded sometimes can pose an issue. So we were fortunate enough to have the ALICE trial funded to enroll. Now we're at 37% to completion, which is pretty good because we only started about a year and a half ago. But it can cause some issues, and having someone review the grant and explain, and maybe, I don't want to say reduce the language, but I mean like making this more comprehensible to non-statisticians is something that you're going to have to spend a little bit more time doing.
Thanks, Naveen. Okay, I think if there's no other further questions from the audience, and just checking the chat here. Okay, I think I just want to thank Tanis and Naveen so much for sharing their insights and all this information with us today. I think this certainly was an excellent lessons learned session for everyone on the call. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I'd like to invite the fellows now to stay on the call, and you will now have an opportunity to ask your own burning questions to Tanis and Naveen. Thanks for coming, everyone.